So maybe let me introduce myself first. My name is Willie Botha. I'm the Technical Director of the IAASB. And joining me from staff, Jasper van den Hout. He's one of our principals on staff, so he'll be taking the notes so that we can have a good debrief afterwards. I think what we can do is, as we go through, when you have your first opportunity to speak, you can maybe just quickly introduce yourself to the group as well. In that way, I think we can get familiar with the whole group. So the idea of this first breakout session is really to look at the expectation gap in the context of fraud and going concern. Jasper has got up to 5 questions that we need to look at during this session. I thought to myself, doing these sessions in the past, the conversation normally flows very naturally. And I don't think we need to very specifically do question 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. I thought maybe we just split it into, and Jasper, if I can ask you to sort of just keep us to an even split of time between the 2 topics. Maybe let's take fraud first. And I think what we want to understand from your perspective, and you know what, we've got some people that come from an environment of those charged with governance, others are from user groups, we've got auditors here, so we've got a good mix of people, and it is very important for us to especially understand the viewpoints from preparers, those charged with governance, and users. So if we look at fraud, we really want to see look at what do you think from your perspective, what is causing the expectation gap? What do you think are the responsibilities of the auditor, or what should those responsibilities be if you believe they're not appropriate or not robust enough at the moment? Do we need additional transparency around auditors reporting on what they do when they look or evaluate fraud during the course of an audit? And what do you think can we, or either the IAASB or other people, do to narrow the gap? So let's use the first part of the session to concentrate on fraud from that perspective of what's causing the expectation gap, how can we narrow the gap, how does auditors' responsibilities factor into this, and is there a need for additional transparency? So I'm going to open up. We can maybe use the raise hand function that you've got in your on the right hand side, and then we can get started.
So my name's Mario Bella. I lead the assurance work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and also working closely with the IAASB on their assurance project, looking at assurance of non-financial information. So in terms of the expectation gap, I mean, one of the things that we found, we did a study with investors with PwC a couple of years ago. And one of the really profound learnings from that was that investors really don't know what assurance is. And I think as a profession, we haven't been very good at explaining in very kind of simple terms what assurance is, and that it's not really insurance, it's assurance, and most people don't get the subtlety of the distinction. I think the other thing that we've seen, particularly in a UK context, is the inability of auditors actually to tie together bits of information. So, for example, in the UK, we have a provision in the Companies Act that requires companies to disclose a viability statement, which is for a period longer than going concern. The average sort of lookout period is 3 years. And we've had companies like Carillion who have had their viability statement reviewed by the auditor, signed off by the directors, financial statements clearly showing that the company was going under given the weight of its debt, and yet it wasn't raised as a key audit matter. So I think this kind of, I know ISA 720 is there to sort of deal with this, but I think there's got to be more around kind of checking the consistency of the story. The story being told in the financials, as well as the story being told by management in the front half, because, you know, often there's a disconnect.
Okay. All right. So those are two interesting points, Mario. Thank you for that. So the one around investors not understanding, so touching on the knowledge gap as we've defined it in the discussion paper, and then very interesting the comment that you said that, and I like the way that you put it, that sometimes there's a lack of, you just get the sense auditors don't put all the pieces together, so see the whole picture and all the stories that are encapsulated in that picture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, Anne, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, indeed. If I might, I'm Anne Molyneux. I'm just the immediate, like last week, recent vice chair of the ICGN, which is the Global Investor Community. And I would like to put the point of view. Definitely, investors do not distinguish the words audit and assurance. One is the same, the two are the same. We're not too sure what we're getting, but hey, there isn't a distinction in our minds. But I would also say the point that that Mario made about the UK context and the inability of auditors to tie two bits together, I think is a fundamental, absolutely fundamental weakness. He talked about the viability statement and 3 years out, but I'll talk about 2008, when auditors were signing off financial statements of banks in February of 2007 or 8, I can't remember the exact year. And then in March, those exact same banks, 1 month later, were going for their handout to governments, we cannot be sustainable. So I think there is some real mismatch in terms of what auditors are educated to do and do. And I think there's an element of simplicity in this. I mean, if you take, you mentioned, Mario mentioned Carillion, in which I was a shareholder, but I would like to mention Wirecard. How can you miss millions of dollars if you actually follow the auditing standards? You need, according to the auditing standards, you have to have third-party confirmation of bank accounts. Simple. So I think there isn't really an expectation gap, but I think there might be more of a behavioural gap. I think auditors have to be absolutely disciplined. In my mind, knowing auditing standards, certainly there should have been a real report very early on, many years on, in the examples of things like Wirecard, and also in Enron circumstance. So yes, to an element I do agree, but I don't think it's just about tying bits of information together. It's about having a practical reality, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so what you're touching on a little bit is on the performance gap, because, and remember, the performance gap has two parts to it. The one is there might be pieces in the standards that are not clear, and that leads to misinterpretation or inconsistency in application. And then the other part of the performance gap is auditors simply don't do what the standards tell them to do. And what you say is you sort of referring to the latter one.
I'm referring to the latter. There might be a little bit of the former in there too.
Yes, yes. It's interesting because Mario and Jay, I'll come to you just now. Mario and Anne has now touched on this fact that investors don't seem to distinguish between audit and assurance and don't really appreciate what they're getting. And I want to actually ask, maybe from your perspective, so what do you think when a user reads the audit opinion? We've conducted our audit in accordance with ISAS. In our opinion, these financial statements fairly present in all material respects, blah, blah, blah. What do you think they're hearing when they read that? So maybe Anne and Mario can think about that, and then I'll bring Jay in. Jay, you've got your hand up for a while already.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. You know, so first of all, I'm from the PCAOB, and of course, anything I say are my own opinions and not the opinions of the PCAOB. I'm also the chair of a working group in IFIAR, and it's the working group that tries to channel the investor and other stakeholder viewpoints into IFIAR and into the sort of thoughts and views of other regulators of audit firms. And my background, I'm an academic and a governance guy, but I have a lot of ties to the investor community. So let me start by saying I understand that there are investors out there that don't understand the difference between assurance and insurance. But if we focus on that, then that becomes kind of an excuse, right? The problem in the fraud area is investors don't really get it, right? Now, I understand there are plenty of individuals, there are plenty of retail investors, probably even some small investment management firms and stuff like that that may not understand this. But there's not a pension plan in the United States that's a major investor in the US market that doesn't understand the difference between assurance and insurance. So I don't think the problem in the fraud space is a failure. It's an expectation that firms are guarantors that there's no fraud in the financial statements. The problem, the main problem is, you know, the standard is that firms have to provide reasonable assurance that financial statements are free from material error from material misstatements due to error and fraud. And here's what we know. The audit focuses on error. It doesn't focus on fraud. Mm-hmm. And whenever we see a major fraud, you know, of course, investors after the fact are asking the questions, why wasn't that caught, right? Why wasn't that problem caught? But the fundamental issue for me up front is, you know, what are firms really doing, given that their assurance obligation applies equally to error and fraud? What are they doing, right? And of course, investors don't know what they're doing because there's only two places that investors could possibly know what firms are doing. From the firms themselves, they don't tell, and from the regulators, right? The regulators inspect, so we do know what they're doing, or we could know what they're doing is a better way to put it. So I will say one thing I think is very important in this space. I think regulators have a significant role in providing insight into what's going on in the fraud space with respect to firms. Regulators could inspect and write anonymized reports to at least say, kind of, here's what's going on out there. Then everyone could be better informed. And what we could do in that case is we could actually debate, is what's actually going on in practice, what should be taking place, what should be happening, right? And that would provide everybody with a more equal, I think, sense of information about what's actually happening in practice.
Okay, that's very helpful, very interesting. I was waiting, I wanted to say something earlier about the knowledge gap, but during the last roundtable we had as well, we also got the sense that, you know, the knowledge gap may be legitimately part of the entire picture, but we also got this message that that shouldn't be an excuse, because I think we need to understand, and that's why I asked the question. So when people read the audit report, what do they think they're reading? And I think, Jay, what you've pointed out is that, again, some of the other role players in the ecosystem, like the regulators, I mean, they see this stuff happening firsthand because they actually have insight into the audit files. They see what auditors did or didn't do. And maybe if there's some way to bring that out, and so to almost share those learnings so that both the auditors and the regulators and the standard setters can all learn from that. So that's a very important message. Ralph?
Yeah, hi Willie, thank you. So I'm Ralph Weinberger, and I am the methodology leader for the global network of PwC, so methodology in our assurance services. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and listen to this conversation and participate. And I find it quite interesting to listen to those who have commented so far, Mario, Ann, and Jay, and the perspectives, frankly, I think in some ways highlight the discussion quite well in terms of the different perspectives and the need for this kind of conversation to make sure that we have a common understanding and ultimately, hopefully, an agreement as to what really could be done in terms of evolving the audit, in terms of making sure that those elements that relate to perceptions versus the execution side are dealt with. The one bit that I wanted to comment on, Jay, I really appreciate your comments, and I think it's fair to say there's space in the performance side of things, what we call the performance gap, but I think there's also space to evolve our thinking in terms of how it is that management and those charged with governance are viewed in this ecosystem, if you will. And in particular, and by the way, this is not a comment to be defensive about the audit methodology or what we do in fraud or don't do in fraud, as Jay just commented on, but rather to say, the auditors need to be independent, but it does need to be a partnership. And I think Jay was alluding to this, between regulators and the profession, but also regulators in different categories and management and those charged with governance. So when Mario talks about the viability statement, or Ann talks about the viability statement, what is the surrounding framework? And specifically what I would say is, I do believe that in the US, the SEC and Sarbanes-Oxley, together with of course PCAOB, which was formed out of that, have a pretty good framework. And in terms of management's the requirement to do certifications on a quarterly and on an annual basis really makes clear to management what their role is. And that includes disclosure controls and procedures. That includes material misstatements, to Jay's point, whether due to error or fraud, and how is management and how is governance overseeing that. So just throw that in.
And I think that's, Ralph, that's a very important point. And in the discussion paper that we released middle of September, we also made a very important point that, everybody in this ecosystem has their role to play. Everybody's got a part to play in this. Obviously, from an IAASB point of view, we're looking from a standard setting point of view and say, is there anything in our standards we can do better? I think, and it was you that referred to a behavior gap. And again, there's other role players there that need to try and reinforce that. And I think we all understand, because, management and those charged with governance in the first instance have to properly discharge their responsibilities, and hopefully also within a framework. And Ralph, I think what you were saying is the more robust that framework is, like, for example, you have in the UK at the moment, that also contributes to narrowing the gap. But equally, on the other side, the auditors, they need to play their part properly. And that's where some of the other things come in, where we've said, are they really following the standards? Do we drive the right behaviors? So I think those are all very important perspectives. So looking a little bit at our fraud discussion paper, and I will come just to you just now, we did highlight what we've heard through our outreach and some of our information gathering and research activities. People pointing at things like maybe we should be looking at involving or requiring more forensic expertise in an audit, in certain circumstances, not sort of as a blanket. We were asking questions about auditors focus on non-material fraud, auditors focus on third-party fraud. Should we strengthen the engagement quality review function? And there's probably many other possibilities as well. So we can also touch on that. Anne, you wanted to come in?
Yes, Willie, I just, one thing, I agree wholeheartedly. The issue about the distinction on terminology, assurance and audit, really isn't a great matter. But what I did want to just suggest is, from a corporate governance perspective, my day job is as a corporate governance consultant, and I largely work with the World Bank, the OECD, clients like that, major enterprises in emerging markets, largely India, China, places like that. I actually believe that a lot of the issues with the outcome, if you like, audited financial statements, whether it's the auditor or the preparer's point of view, I don't necessarily believe that audit committees are as strong in their challenge of the external auditor and of management as they could be. I actually feel there are some audit committees that work very, very well, and it really will depend very much on the nature of the chairman, I think, but and the expertise around the table on audit committees. But many audit committees just don't have sufficient knowledge about audit practices, about financial statement development practices, to really ask the hard questions. And so that they can see a number sticking out. Well, my God, that's $50 million missing from a bank, or where's it in the bank account? They don't get the tie-up sometimes. So I think there's a weakness maybe in those charged with governance.
Okay, so you're also adding to Ralph's perspective in terms of all the different players. Is there a sense, and I know, Jay, you raised the point that when we look at what the standards say an auditor does, obtaining reasonable assurance whether the financial statements are not free from material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, both those components. Is there an aspect of doing the basic things right all of the time, and that we sometimes miss that as a sort of as a basic principle to work by? Because someone said earlier, I think it was you, how could people miss that $50 billion on a balance sheet didn't exist? Is there part of that doing the basic things right all of the time? Do we forget about those basics? Mario?
I was on a webinar last week, and Mark Carney and Sue Lloyd from the IAASB, amongst others, were on there. Mark Carney was talking about dynamic materiality, and I think, if we think about that from an auditor's perspective, and really testing the assertions that are being made by management. And there's an interesting report that's out by I think it's called the National Whistleblowers Association in the US, that argues that there's a huge amount of fraud going on amongst fossil fuel companies that haven't written down their reserves. So I think there's a lot of issues like climate change, again, where we're not joining up the dots. I mean, Sue Lloyd, as the vice chair of the IAASB, said that, well, both, and there was a lot of criticism of auditors. She was saying, well, the standards are very clear. You should be impairing your assets to take into account things like climate change and other things, and the auditors should be checking that that's being done. But yet, I don't know. As a profession, I think we've just been too slow to the party, because we see these kind of cliff edge write-downs, and it does have to make you wonder. I mean, this isn't new. We've known about climate change. We've known, I mean, and climate change is one example. But I just wonder whether we need to do more on professional skepticism, because, I mean, at the end of the day, the auditor has to exercise their professional judgment. And I'm not, and I don't mean this as a criticism of the firms, but I just wonder whether that's become too much of a process.
Okay. All right. So again, touching on the principle of bringing all the pieces together, thinking about all the relevant things that could impact the amounts and disclosures in the financial statements. Jay, I'm going to come to you, and then I think we should maybe just turn our attention a little bit to the going concern side of the debate as well.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. I agree with Anne and Ralph. This is it's an ecosystem, right? And there's responsibilities by everybody. The PCAOB, we're uniquely focused on audit firms, and we don't have oversight over audit committees. And were we, right? They're part of a package. And what I would say for me in the States, audit firm communication to the audit committee is so critical, because once it's communicated, the audit committee has responsibilities. You can't bury your head in the sand if you're told about a problem. You may or may not fully understand it, but if you don't know about it, that's kind of a defense later for the audit committee. Well, I didn't know, probably, you know, and once the audit firm tells them, they're now obligated, I think, to sort of take some responsibility for it. So certainly the communication flow and the disclosure, certainly with respect to things that are related to fraud, you know, and things like that. I mean, those can be, I think, hard conversations to have with the audit committee, but they do then, I think, put the responsibility sort of where it belongs kind of in the governance process. You know, let me just give you one quick example though, you know, for me, you know, when I think about the standards, so the standards, for example, there's an element of the standards that's designed to, I think, provide deterrence for fraud, right? So we talk about detection of fraud. There's also deterrence of fraud, right? And that's the portion of the standard that says you have to be unpredictable in your procedures that you use. There's a deep body of academic literature that suggests that unpredictable procedures have become predictable because you do the same thing year in and year out, or, you know, you might test more, but you don't test differently, you know, or something like that, right? And so, you know, one place where I think, frankly, you know, look, I'm sure, Ralph, you would agree with this. There's nobody out there that doesn't think unpredictable should be unpredictable, right? But I think probably what happens, I'm basing this not on anything the PCAOB has seen, but based on the academic literature, you kind of get into a groove and you sort of do things a certain way, right? And if regulators took a look at that and wrote a report and said, here's kind of what unpredictable looks like, and here's how to make unpredictable better, I think that everybody would be interested in that and benefit from that. And I think that would help then, for example, have investors have more confidence that the deterrent aspect of the standard is being performed in a more, you know, in a way that's designed to sort of promote deterrence, right? So I think there are things that would flow just directly from a better understanding of the practices that are going on out there and ways to make the existing set of practices better. And that doesn't even require a change in the standard. That just requires a better understanding of how the standard is being implemented.
Okay. All right. I also just want to see, I know that Peter is on the line. I know his video is off, but Peter, I want to give you an opportunity if you want to contribute.
Yes, Peter from CARE, I'm online. However, my camera is off because we have company restrictions because of the capacity on broadband, because everyone is working at home. I agree with the speakers, the input from the different speakers. Myself, I'm representing the Institute of Internal Auditors. I'm a member of the Global Advocacy Committee there, and in my day job, I'm head of internal audit for the Swedish Transport Administration, managing all the roads and railways in Sweden, the infrastructure, so to say. Yes, as I started, I agree with the input from the different speakers. I have a feeling that we have some challenges in reviewing soft issues. So not only, I mean, you are all experts in testing and hard facts and numbers and computer systems, etc. But soft issues in companies and the whole area of the internal environment, it's very challenging, but very necessary to do. And also, I think part of the expectation gap could be that we are focusing maybe too little on management, and that's, I think, is in general both from internal audit and external audit side, because we are probably too much focusing on middle management and managers in the organization, and we are too little thinking of the of things that we certainly don't believe can happen, but things that actually are happening in all of the scandals that you have referred to here. So from my point of view, soft issues and top management should be more focused by all auditors.
So Ralph, I'm sorry, Peter, when you refer to soft issues, that's more the behavioral aspects. Are we looking for the right red flags, culture, tone at the top, those type of things.
Exactly, and to develop the ability to see through the soft issues, because it's like in the case of Enron, they had an awarded code of conduct, etc. So on the surface, it looked great, but to see through the surface is very challenging and so necessary.
Okay. So I'm just conscious of time, and I just want us to share a few thoughts on going concern as well. So maybe, again, we believe this is also a component of the, also one of the topics that can contribute to the expectation gap. In our discussion paper, we highlighted a number of issues that, again, that we've learned or we've been told through our outreach, and that is looking at the period of assessment, the 12 months after the reporting date, looking at, is there maybe a confusion between all the different concepts we're using to describe the resilience of a company, viability statement, going concern, all these different concepts. And do we all have a common understanding, and is there a common interpretation of what does it mean to say that there's a material uncertainty related to going concern? So those were some of the aspects that came out in our information gathering and research. So I'll be happy to hear from the group some perspectives around going concern in relation to the expectation gap. Ralph?
But yeah, it really. Listen. I would want to be, cautious to differentiate entirely what we're talking about here between fraud and going concern.
Yes.
But I agree we should comment on it. And I would say maybe one of the areas in going concern, and by the way, your paper did an excellent job, I thought, of articulating this, that I think one of our problems in the profession and across the reporting ecosystem with respect to going concern is this inconsistency in frameworks that are out there, from the financial reporting frameworks in particular, but also kind of the expectation of what's to be done in terms of material uncertainties. And I don't think the standards are unclear, but I think the interpretations, and that interpretation is certainly, from the auditors themselves. The financial reporting framework can create some of that, and then ultimately the real part that I have some concern with is the term going concern and ability to continue as a going concern. I think that's a really hard concept for somebody that's not, if you will, inside of what it is an auditor does. So again, bringing it back to what Jay was saying, what is an auditor actually doing? And certainly we have CAMs available to report, and we have the section in the audit report when we do have a material uncertainty. But do the intended users of the financial statements even understand? And it's not a criticism of the users, it's a criticism of ourselves, I think. Do they really understand what all that means?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we did highlight that we've seen that this, the phrase, the entity's ability to continue as a going concern, that's something that's not well understood. And that might be one of the main causes of the problem. You also mentioned the financial reporting framework, that we did pick up that there's a sense that there's a little bit of a mismatch between what auditors are required to do, but auditors are also not the providers of original information. The information must in the first place be disclosed by the company. And maybe not, that companies maybe not have very clear guidelines in terms of what to disclose in the first place about going concern and how they assess going concern.
I think that's right. I wanted to say also, though, I started with, I don't think we can completely differentiate going concern from fraud. We can, of course, as a topical area, but what I wanted to clarify is the comments that we've heard today. I would imagine, I don't want to speak for anybody here on this discussion, but I think a lot of similarities in some of the topics that have been shared, or some of the views, that have been shared.
Yeah. No, I certainly take the point that a lot of that, what we've already mentioned, applies to both fraud and going concern in terms of a general approach. Yeah, Mario.
So, Willie, I totally agree with your point, and often it's kind of missed that ultimately it's management making these assertions, and really it's for management and the governance of the company to make the judgment about whether or not the company is a going concern. I mean, that goes to the very heart of the fiduciary duties of the directors. I think part of the problem, though, is it's almost an impossible task, because every company knows the consequence, and so do auditors, of saying we're no longer a going concern, or we have question marks around our viability. I mean, you know, within a nanosecond, the share price will fall like a stone. So I understand the concept, and it's a really important one, and it's like the Kingman report in the UK concluded that, you know, basically viability statements were a waste of time because they're not done very well. And, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, you know, this is there's a lot of merit in the requirement, but the way it's been executed means that it's been a rather kind of meaningless disclosure. So I don't know whether we have to rethink this, because I just don't think in the real world anyone's going to put up their hand until the very last minute, and then it's too late. So I think if we stand back and think about investor protection and, you know, all the safeguards our system is meant to, checks and balances, our regulatory system and legal system are meant to put into place, I think this remains a kind of an unspoken kind of limitation. I haven't expressed that very well, but it's just I think a kind of fundamental.
Yeah, because what you're saying is business, there's a limitation in the sense that going concern inherently requires you to say something, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anne, I saw your hand going up.
Yes, just as soon as I saw Mario start to talk about the going concern, I cannot but tell you the pressures that are on internally in an organization if you are anywhere near that position. The pressures about, well, that becomes a fait accompli, well, the shares will crater, then all our other debts become due, etc., etc. I cannot but wholeheartedly agree. Going concern is a very difficult concept. It's much easier to say, yes, we are a going concern in calm and stable times. But I think a good time is just going to be coming up shortly, and I'd say in the next year or two, to study going concern statements and the time frames in which those kinds of decisions and under the pressures that those kinds of decisions are going to be made. Because I think it's not really something that you can go against, and it's not really something you're really totally free to say, well, we've got a question mark about our going concern. I think management will do everything before they say that.
Okay.
But could I jump in, Willie? I agree with the comments from Mario and Ann in terms of the reaction of management. But let's come back to the relationship and the responsibilities of the various parties here. And I guess this is maybe I'll use a question rather than a statement and say, do we believe in those circumstances that these reporting entities, and we're talking in this case, not obviously, but likely in some kind of a public environment, whether they're listed or otherwise public interest entities, that management has in place the appropriate processes and understanding of their own going concern assessment, and whether there are risk conditions that they should be bringing forward and disclosing. And then coming back again to my earlier point, to governance, and also to the entity's own system of internal control over reporting. And well, first of all, identifying and reporting those uncertainties. Is if that's all in place, do they have an option other than to disclose those things? And then if they don't disclose them, is it not then the auditor's responsibility to assist with getting that right, but within the context of it all having been identified by the entity's processes and controls?
Is there, so as Ralph and Anne was speaking, I was thinking, because I get the sense that what we're saying is that companies will always be very hesitant to go out and say, listen, we've got a going concern problem, or listen, there's an uncertainty in this area. Is there a way to destigmatize that by more information? So not necessarily quantity, but also the quality of information in terms of, so can that negative reaction from the market be countered by more and the right information to add that transparency?
Willie, if I may, I think it's very closely tied to the manner and style in which a company is regularly reporting its risk and its changes to risk. If you are a company that is a good reporter of risk, the risks that you're facing, the changes, what's growing, what's shrinking, how it comes, then when an issue arises that will challenge going concern, it's already really been raised. Yeah. So it's not new news, and it's not as market, it'll be have a market impact, but it's not as big an impact on the market. So I think those two things, and it is a management issue, clearly, and a governance issue to report. And generally, from my perspective, I assess whole listings of companies in their governance, and risk reporting is one side that is regularly poor.
Okay.